Hi, and welcome to this edition of the OBFA-TRANSFORM video series, where we discuss and explain research and articles from members of our research group. I'm Olan McEvoy. I'm a doctoral researcher here at the Global Climate Forum, working on the OBFA-TRANSFORM project. And I'm here today with Friederike Reimer. She's also a doctoral researcher working on our project. And we're here to discuss Friederike's paper, which was released earlier this year, called Schrödinger's Off-Balance Sheet Fiscal Agency, the Recovery and Resilience Facility, and the Limits to Incremental Fiscal Integration in Europe. So thanks for being here today with me, Friederike. Just to start off with, I thought that we could recap what the Recovery and Resilience Facility actually was and how did it come about.
Yeah, happy to talk to you about this paper that I wrote together with some other members of the group. The Recovery and Resilience Facility is part of Next Generation EU, which was the EU's response to the COVID pandemic and was established in May 2020. And it provides 750 billion euros to member states in the form of loans and grants. And it's debt financed. So this is like one of the biggest presences that the EU now has on bond markets. There was all this discussion, is this like Europe's Hamiltonian moment where we have a fiscal union to complement the monetary union? So this is the thing everyone's been talking about at the time and also in the literature. So we bring our angle to this.
Okay, and just to start off with the actual paper, I was wondering, what is it actually that the paper sets out to explain? So you have these concepts already in the title, off-balance sheet fiscal agencies, or OBFAs as the acronym is, which is a core concept of our group, and also incremental fiscal integration in the EU. So what do these actually tell you about the RRF?
Sure. So as you say, OBFAs are like a big part of this group, and at the core of this larger idea is that how do states spend money, basically, to break it down, and that this doesn't only happen through the core budget of the state, but also through all these other entities, such as development banks, state-owned companies, other public banks, and these special funds, the German Sondervermögen being quite famous in the European context. And so we argue that these always have been part of states, and in the EU specifically, they're part of this larger process of governing through OBFAs, which is also something that Stefan and Andre, two of the co-authors, have developed in a separate paper. That because you have this Maastricht regime of like the treaties and like these fiscal constraints in the EU, every time there's a crisis, you have to govern through these off-balance sheet fiscal agencies. And this is basically like one of the latest emergences of one of these entities in the COVID crisis.
Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of literature that came out around that time on the Next Generation EU programs and the RRF in particular. And it's been discussed from many different angles by economists, lawyers, political scientists. In the paper, you state that the gap that you find is that most of these scholars looked at it through this money out perspective, and that you and your co-authors rather took a money in perspective. Could you just explain what that actually means?
Yes, so you mentioned that the literature looks more on the money out perspective. So right, I mean, we have this big pot of new money that is being spent, and there are all these new mechanisms through which they're being spent, all this conditionality that's being imposed by the European Commission, and this has been the subject of many papers basically. And but it's not the focus of our paper, because we basically look how the money comes into the pot, which is by issuing debt, which is this puzzle at the heart of the research question, or the first research question: how is it possible that the RRF or the EU through the RRF is issuing all of this debt? And despite the fiscal rules, using it more as like a loose term, not only the national fiscal rules, but also the ones at the supranational level, which actually forbid debt issuance. So how is this possible?
Mm-hmm. And in studying this gap, you apply the group's framework, which is the monetary architecture framework, and also you say that you use critical macro finance as a framework. What do you mean by that? And also, how does this help you to study this issue?
One of the core ideas that is present both in this like monetary architecture and critical macrofinance is this focus on like the financial plumbing of the system, which even just the concept of OBFAs is already like an instance of that being applied, right? So in not saying, well, the EU needs some sort of fiscal union to accompany the monetary one, we actually like zoom into the institutional layer and see, oh, like which entities are basically doing what. Is it like the EU Treasury? Does that exist? Is it the ESM, which is also part of the EU, but then a separate entity, the European Stability Mechanism? In our framework, at least, it's also an OBFA. So this is one of the ways in which we look at the financial plumbing of this whole situation, rather than employing like a broad economic model, for example, which is then something you could also do. So with this idea of the plumbing, we also look at the instruments that are important here, not only the institutions. So these bonds that are being issued, what are like their properties, like how are they being established, what counterparties do hold them, like really understanding the macro financial system as a web of interlocking balance sheets, which is part of the monetary architecture framework. Yeah, this is what really informs our understanding of the RRF here as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And so through applying these frameworks to this issue, you come up in the paper with two core concepts that help you to explain the status of the RRF. So the first one is that it has an institutional ambiguity to it. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Sure. I mean, this also comes to in the title, right? We already see Schrödinger's off-balance sheet fiscal agency. It's quite a mouthful. So I guess it's a good point to also explain what this means. Is that, I mean, people probably know Schrödinger's cat, which is like this thought experiment of like a cat in a box and then like some particles falling apart and then poisoning or not poisoning the cat. So you have this indeterminate state that the cat is in. Is it dead or alive? And in a similar way, we also find the RF in this indeterminate state, which has two dimensions, the first of which being the institutional ambiguity, where the RF is simultaneously part of the EU budget and not part of the EU budget, depending on which perspectives you take. So if you look at more like this more maybe economic perspective, where you're like, well, it is part of the multi-annual financial framework, which is the EU's long-term budget, like more like procedurally, like there's the European semester, the reporting that this is tied into, the guarantee structure resembles, just like a normal budget, that this is just like part of the budget and like the money is being spent from this pot, so it must be part of the budget. But then if you look at the legal side of it, it is not part of the budget because it's like actually against some of the treaty provisions that the budget is debt financed, so you can't do that. And then the RF is something that stands outside of the EU budget, the European Recovery Instrument, which is then the more legal framework around it. Please read the paper if you see the details. So there's an extra budgetary fund which is raising the money through debt issuance and then channeling them into the budget, which then works around like this legal provisioning that you can't have a debt finance budget.
Mm-hmm. And then the second concept about why it's Schrödinger's OBFA is that the RRF is mortal and that its debt is mortal, more specifically. Can you say some more about that?
Sure. Yeah, this then comes into what I've mentioned, that we look at like the instruments of the RRF and more specifically the bonds it issues and the debt it issues. Basically, because it's such a like large volume of debt being issued, the EU resembles a sovereign debt issuer, just like, I don't know, Germany or France. Like if you look at the scale, it's quite similar in like the main years of the RRF activity. So the EU is also trying to resemble a sovereign issuer. They set up all this infrastructure and so on and so forth. And then we bring in like this idea of safe assets, which I mean has also been widely discussed, but the idea that public debt is not only repaid, so like this idea of, every bond needs to be repaid and then it like is gone, right? But that in financial markets, public debt has this function to be rolled over continuously and have a constant presence in the market to serve as a sort of benchmark that other financial instruments are being valued against and so on and so forth. So, I mean, this issue of like, euro-denominated safe asset, like there's a whole literature about this. And we kind of look at the RRF bonds and ask like, can like the EU actually issue these safe assets through programs like the RRF. And we find like, no, they can't, because of the way that the RRF is being set up in this institutional ambiguity, where it's quite close to the budget and therefore limited in time because of the way that it's set up legally. The RRF is not an immortal sovereign issuer, which can just roll over debt indefinitely and have the safe asset function on financial markets, but rather it is already dead. Because, I mean, right now it's a large presence, it's very much alive, like a lot of people are probably working very hard to ensure good financing conditions and so on and so forth. And yeah, banks are borrowing them, they set up primary dealer networks, but yeah, it's not there indefinitely, and therefore the death is already being anticipated by financial markets as well.
So from your perspective, these two issues with it, that it's institutionally ambiguous and that it's mortal, do these limit the effectiveness of the RRF and the possibilities for fiscal integration in Europe?
Yeah, I mean, this is the point we make, that we say, well, how is it possible that so much debt could be issued and is still being issued under the RRF? I mean, it's still until 2027 is when the money is being spent, and 2058, I believe, is when the last bonds will be repaid. I think there's some level of success there, right? Because they've managed to do it, but yeah, it goes to show that like it's not something that's very easily replicated because of like the also a bit fragile position that it occupies in this layer of being very, very close to the budget, where you have this like very like careful legal reasoning that is like extra budgetary, and at the same time it's still a special fund, so it's still separate. So yeah, we kind of argue that there's only so much you can do with this like incremental fiscal integration in these crises, because you still cannot, like, yeah, maybe another solution in the next crisis is to then move away from the budget again. We discussed this in the paper.
Yeah. And I mean, this idea of that Europe progresses from crisis to crisis and incrementally integrates has become even more relevant since you wrote the paper and since the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, we're living in a more geopolitically fragmented world. There's war on the European continent. There's also trade tensions with the Trump administration in Washington. And also there's many discussions in Europe, such as from Mario Draghi, about that Europe has lost its competitive edge, and that there's a need for further fiscal integration and further fiscal programs to bring Europe back up to speed. So how do you think, or what do you think that your paper can say about these issues and the relevance of them for the European Union today?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Draghi, and I think Draghi actually quite explicitly also brings in the opportunity of rolling over the next generation EU, so RF debt for like these purposes, which I think is interesting, because my understanding of the legal situation is this is quite complicated, and goes to show like the divide between maybe also, even if the political ambition was there, like the lock-in into like the EU like world that they have created or we've created, I don't know, is quite present. So then this goes to show that the limits that we show as well are very present, despite all this, like, as you say, geopolitical ambition, which I guess, yeah, having some sort of fiscal union, there's still many steps to go, also like on the revenue collecting side of the EU.
Yeah, but I mean, I found the paper very enlightening, and I'd encourage anybody watching to read it. I think it's still incredibly relevant. Thank you for answering all of my questions. I just wanted to end with asking more generally about your experience of writing the paper. So this is your first published journal article. How was the experience of writing this, going through the peer review process, and what did you learn from all of that?
Yeah, I've learned quite a lot. I mean, as you say, it's the first publication, and I mean, it was previously part of my thesis, so it's like, and then part of the research group, we turned it into an article, which is like, has been this long process, which I mean, always also exhausting at times, and but even also like in preparing for this video, after not having looked at it for a few months, I realized really again, like, how many little details there are, and like how like all this legal reasoning and all like this institutional setup and then the financial side of it is like forms this like complex interplay of things. So it's like it's just very interesting what this yields. I don't know, like as a researcher as well, but also like just goes to show what the challenges of the world are, that in the end you end up with these indeterminate constructs in the search for metaphors. You go to quantum physics to describe them. And it just goes to show that like the world is not like linear and black and white, but actually very complicated and yeah, interesting to study.
Well, I find it fascinating, and I think that we discuss this in the group a lot, that every day that there's a new news about a new off-balance sheet fiscal agency that's being created for solving whatever issue and crisis is coming up in the European Union in particular. So I think there'll be a lot more for you to study in the future in this complicated world. Yes, and so thank you to Friederike for talking to me today about this paper, and thank you to everyone who's watching, and stay tuned for future discussions of our group's research.